Throughout the Second World War and before, to desert from your post was considered very shameful. During World War I, the British Army executed many people who deserted and were convicted of this crime and also cowardice. These executions, known as the Shot at Dawn executions, were heavily criticised after the conflict, but during the Second World War there was a collection of German deserters who were shot dead, even after the Germans had surrendered to the Allies, and Hitler had taken his own life inside the Führer bunker in Berlin. The story of these men who were executed is a rather interesting one, as it's believed they were illegally court-martialed. There were many accounts of men of the German armed forces being executed after the war. Many were deemed war criminals, and a large portion of those executed were men and women who worked inside of concentration camps. But there were other soldiers who were found guilty of being members of the military, who conducted large-scale atrocities and also mass killings. However, what is the story of the German deserters who were shot dead on the 13th of May 1945? Remember to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Throughout the Second World War, it is believed that 22,500 Germans were sentenced to death for desertion, and around 15,000 were either shot or were guillotined. Around 5,000 others were condemned for defeatism or for subverting national defence, which included actions such as criticising Hitler or assuming that the war was over. Many of those who were convicted ended up dying inside of prisons before their execution date came. Today the German government look at these cases of these people on an individual basis, and some people have been pardoned, but the German authorities were certain as to what the punishment should be for those who were considered deserters. It was said that the soldier can die, the deserter must die, and as the war was turning against the Wehrmacht following huge defeats at Stalingrad and in North Africa, desertion became a rather serious issue in the Wehrmacht's ranks. The problem got worse after the Normandy invasions and the advances made towards the German heartland, and it was believed that by the end of the war there were more than 100,000 German deserters. These were men who left their post and abandoned the fight. Some fled the battlefield, and many took strong actions against their homeland. For example, Stefan Hampel, who when witnessing the murder of Jews in Belarus, he burned his German army uniform and then joined a Polish resistance group in Lithuania. Hampel was then later arrested and was condemned to die, but he managed to survive the conflict. Others who deserted fell victim to court-martials, and many were convicted without any evidence. Many of those were shot on sight if they mentioned anything that was anti-Hitler, and it was said that military justice was above all political justice, serving to stabilise Nazi power and to prolong the war. Another example of a deserter was a man named Baumann, who managed to escape France. He stole a pistol and a flashlight and left Bordeaux in civilian clothing. However, along with another man, he was caught by guards at a border crossing. On the 30th of June 1942, 3 judges sentenced the deserters to die in the name of the German people. But this man's father managed to get the sentence commuted to 12 years in prison, but Baumann was later sent to serve in a punishment battalion which fought against the might of the Red Army. But there was one infamous case of deserter executions which are today known as the 13th of May 1945 German deserter executions. This was a couple of executions that occurred 5 days after Nazi Germany had surrendered to the Allies along with the Wehrmacht. This specific case was when an illegal court-martial took place, with a group of disarmed German soldiers who had been kept under Allied guard, acting as the judge and also the jury. The Allied forces in the Netherlands, and specifically Amsterdam, used these German officers to have a trial against 2 former German deserters from the Kriegsmarine, named Bruno Dorfer and Ranier Beck. The pair had been caught deserting from the German Navy, and there were many who did this during the conflict, especially towards the end of the war. So the Allied authorities held this trial with German POWs acting as the judges, and the show trial took place inside an abandoned Ford Motor Company assembly plant found outside of Amsterdam. This place at the time was being used as a prisoner of war camp, which was then being looked after and run by the Canadian Army. It was said of the trial that, under a dubious interpretation of international law, Canadian military authorities permitted a continuation of the German military structure after the demise of the Third Reich. German assistance was indispensable in the disarmament, concentration and evacuation of the German armed forces within Holland. Unfortunately, disinterested Canadian military authorities also left the German military in control of order and discipline. German commanders and military judges applied a military law warped by National Socialism. During this trial inside of the former Ford factory, the German officers found the 2 members of the Kriegsmarine as guilty of desertion, and with this they condemned them to death. After all, this was an illegal court, and following this the Nazi German prisoners of war then gathered a firing squad made up of their own men to carry out the death sentence. The Canadian Army overseers gave the German POWs German rifles, and also a 3-ton truck given to them by the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada. They were then given an escort by a platoon of Canadian soldiers. They were led towards a firing squad which had been assembled. What is bizarre with this incident is that the Canadian Army and the Allied forces allowed in theory the enemy to take the lives of some of their own soldiers after the Germans had surrendered. In the firing range the men were secured before the German POWs armed with their rifles were told to ready themselves. They were then given the go-ahead to fire into the 2 deserters, and with this incident the German deserters were shot dead instantly and were killed. The justification behind this event is that the Canadian military authorities felt they had to listen to the Germans and get them on side, as they had a huge task of disarming and evacuating the German armed forces in the Netherlands. They needed them to be disciplined and not to rebel against them, and with this they allowed the execution 5 days after the surrender was signed, almost saying that German military law was in existence after the surrender, and that the German officers wanted to punish people who they believed had brought shame to their country. Joseph Goebbels and his Ministry of Propaganda had managed to convince most of the Germans and civilians, as well as the military, that they were doing the right thing. They were convinced that fighting was for the greater good, and with this they saw deserters who went against this as the lowest criminals that there was. There was a large amount of desertion in the final days of the war, when it was clear to the German soldiers within Germany that they were about to lose the war. Despite this, Hitler called upon the Volkssturm, a fighting group of civilians who were armed with whatever they could get their hands on, to defend the fatherland. But thousands of Germans did surrender at the end of the war to the enemy. They were then taken into prisoner of war camps. So as mentioned, German deserters inside of Germany were considered the most terrible people, as they had gone against Hitler in the war effort. But there were many episodes of deserters who were executed using the guillotine and firing squads, but the British and Americans looked more favourable upon those who refused to fight or left their post. They seem to have moved on from what occurred during the First World War, with the shot at dawn executions, but the executions that took place on the 13th of May 1945 were rather bizarre and were very strange. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.